There is a moment in every real collapse scenario that nobody prepares you for. Not the chaos, not the darkness, not the hunger. The moment that breaks most people is the one where everything they thought they knew turns out to be wrong, and they realize it too late to correct course. That moment is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It arrives quietly, in the form of a decision made 3 weeks earlier, a supply purchased 6 months ago, a skill practiced once and never again. The prepper community has grown dramatically over the last 2 decades. Millions of people worldwide now stock food, water, and gear. They study grid-down scenarios, research EMP threats, practice fire starting and water filtration. And yet, survival data from real disasters, from Hurricane Katrina to the 2010 Haiti earthquake, from the 2011 Tōhoku catastrophe to extended blackouts across South America and South Asia, consistently shows that even prepared individuals make catastrophic errors in the first 72 hours of a genuine collapse event. The reason is not a lack of information. The reason is that certain foundational truths about survival science are systematically underemphasized, misunderstood, or buried beneath layers of gear reviews, product recommendations, and oversimplified checklists. What follows is not a list of tips. It is an examination of 3 deeply misunderstood survival realities that most experienced preppers believe they understand, and almost universally apply incorrectly when it matters most. The first reality begins with water. Every prepper knows water is critical. The commonly cited figure, 3 days without water leads to death, is repeated so frequently that it has become almost meaningless background noise in the survival community. People hear it, nod, and move on to calculating how many gallons to store per person per day. The standard recommendation is 1 gallon per person per day, often extended to 1.5 gallons in hot climates or during physical exertion. These figures are not wrong, but they are dangerously incomplete, and the incompleteness is where real people die. The critical error most preppers make is not in the quantity of water they store. It is in the physiological assumption embedded within that calculation. The 1 gallon per day figure assumes a baseline metabolic state, a person at rest in a moderate temperature environment, performing minimal physical activity. In a genuine collapse scenario, none of those conditions exist. A person bugging out on foot through a summer environment while carrying a loaded pack will lose between 1 and 2 liters of fluid per hour through sweat alone. Add to this the elevated cortisol and adrenaline output of a high-stress survival situation, which accelerates respiration and increases insensible water loss through the lungs and skin even in the absence of visible sweating. Add thermoregulatory demands. Add the fact that most people in crisis situations will be sleeping in suboptimal conditions, which disrupts the hormonal cycles that normally allow the kidneys to concentrate urine and conserve water during sleep. The result is that a person in an active collapse scenario, moving, stressed, sleeping poorly, exposed to temperature extremes, may require 3 to 4 times the standard storage calculation just to maintain cognitive function. And cognitive function is not a luxury in survival. It is the primary tool that separates those who make effective decisions from those who make fatal ones. The hidden science here is neurological. The human brain is approximately 73% water by mass. A fluid deficit of as little as 2% of total body weight, which in a 75-kilogram adult is roughly 1.5 liters, produces measurable degradation in short-term memory, spatial reasoning, and decision-making speed. A deficit of 4% produces significant impairment equivalent in some studies to moderate alcohol intoxication. At 6%, hallucinations and severe coordination loss begin. Most people will not feel critically thirsty until they are already at 2 to 3% deficit, because the thirst sensation mechanism in the hypothalamus lags behind actual cellular dehydration. This means that by the time a person in a collapse environment consciously registers intense thirst, their decision-making capability has already been compromised. They will be rationing water using a brain that is already malfunctioning. They will be making navigational, tactical, and social decisions about who to trust, which route to take, whether to stay or go, from a neurological baseline that is measurably impaired. And they will not know it, because impaired cognition reduces metacognitive awareness. You cannot accurately assess your own mental degradation when the organ doing the assessing is the one that is degraded. The survival implication of this is not simply store more water. It is to completely restructure your collapse hydration strategy around the reality of cognitive preservation, not just physical survival. Water is not primarily a physical resource in a collapse scenario. It is a cognitive resource. The prepper who understands this will prioritize hydration not when they feel thirsty, but on a rigid schedule derived from activity level and environmental conditions, treating water intake as a tactical operational requirement rather than a comfort response. They will also build redundant purification capacity far beyond what their stored supply represents, because storage is finite and events are not. The evidence for this comes from military operational research, not survival blogs. The United States Army Research Institute of Environmental Medicine has conducted extensive studies on fluid replacement in operational environments, and the data consistently shows that even mild dehydration degrades soldier performance on complex cognitive tasks by margins significant enough to affect mission outcomes. This is not theoretical. This is applied physiology that the military takes seriously enough to build into operational doctrine. And it is the same physiology that governs every human being in a collapse scenario, regardless of whether they are wearing a uniform. The second reality is fire, specifically, the relationship between fire and thermal regulation that most preppers fundamentally misunderstand. Fire, in the prepper imagination, is primarily about warmth and cooking. These are real functions. But the science of human thermoregulation reveals a far more complex and dangerous relationship between fire, shelter, and survival physiology that almost no mainstream prepping resource addresses with adequate depth. The misunderstanding begins with hypothermia. Most people, including most experienced preppers, believe that hypothermia is a cold weather threat. This is partially correct, but dangerously narrow. Clinical hypothermia, defined as a core body temperature below 35 degrees Celsius, can develop at ambient temperatures as high as 10 to 15 degrees Celsius if the person is wet, in wind, or physiologically compromised through exhaustion, inadequate caloric intake, or dehydration. This is not an edge case. It is a well-documented clinical reality that emergency physicians in temperate climates encounter regularly. The 2013 journal article published in the Scandinavian Journal of Trauma, Resuscitation and Emergency Medicine documented multiple hypothermia cases presenting in environments that most people would categorize as cool rather than cold. A wet person in a 12 degrees Celsius environment with a light wind can lose core body temperature at a rate that produces clinical hypothermia within 2 to 3 hours. A collapse scenario frequently produces exactly this combination of conditions: inadequate shelter, physical exertion that soaks clothing with sweat, evening temperature drops, wind exposure, and the prepper who has trained for hypothermia as a winter-specific threat will not recognize the danger until it is already physiologically entrenched. The hidden science here involves the physiology of vasoconstriction and the body's thermal defense mechanisms. When core temperature begins to drop, the body initiates peripheral vasoconstriction. It reduces blood flow to the extremities to protect core organ temperature. This process, while effective in the short term, creates a dangerous feedback loop that most people are unaware of. As blood is shunted away from the arms and legs, the extremities cool rapidly. Cold extremities lose dexterity, reducing the person's ability to build shelter, light fire, or perform any fine motor task. The degraded motor function makes it harder to take corrective action, which allows core temperature to continue dropping. Meanwhile, shivering, the body's primary involuntary thermogenic mechanism, begins consuming glucose at a dramatically elevated rate. A person who is shivering intensely can exhaust their available blood glucose within 30 to 60 minutes if they have not recently consumed adequate carbohydrates. Once glucose is depleted and glycogen stores begin to be mobilized, the shivering response weakens, and core temperature drops accelerate sharply. This is the physiological cliff edge of hypothermia, the point where the body's active defense mechanisms begin to fail. And it happens quietly. The person experiencing it often reports paradoxical warmth, a well-documented phenomenon caused by the sudden vasodilation of peripheral vessels as the autonomic nervous system loses its ability to maintain vasoconstriction. People in this state remove their clothing. They feel warm. They are dying. The survival implication for fire use is therefore not about generating warmth after you are cold. It is about preventing the thermal cascade before it begins. Fire in a survival context must be understood as a preventive physiological intervention, not a reactive comfort measure. The prepper who builds a fire after they are already shivering is already behind the physiological curve. They are using a slow, external heat source to combat a fast, internal collapse process, and the math is rarely in their favor in field conditions. The correct application of fire science in collapse survival involves three elements that almost no mainstream prepping source teaches in combination: windbreak construction before fire ignition, insulation of the ground surface to prevent conductive heat loss, which can exceed radiated heat loss by a factor of 4, and caloric preloading before exposure to cold environments. Because the body's thermogenic capacity is fundamentally a function of available metabolic fuel. Evidence from wilderness search and rescue case studies across North America and Scandinavia consistently shows that hypothermia fatalities occur not in extreme cold, but in moderate cold combined with wet conditions and inadequate caloric reserves. The fire was often present. The shelter was often attempted. The fatal variable, in case after case, was that the corrective action began too late, and the metabolic fuel to sustain the body's internal heating mechanisms was already depleted. The third reality is the one that no one in the prepper community likes to examine directly, because it challenges a foundational assumption that runs through nearly all survival training and media. The assumption is this: that in a genuine, extended collapse scenario, the primary threats are environmental, water scarcity, temperature, injury, disease. These are real threats. The data, however, from every documented extended societal disruption in the modern era tells a different story. The primary threat in a collapse scenario, past the first 72 hours, is not the environment. It is other people, not in the dramatic, cinematic sense of raiders and warlords, but in the precise, statistical, sociological sense of resource. Competition among desperate populations who were never prepared to be in competition and who are operating under extreme stress, sleep deprivation, and cognitive impairment. The science behind this is rooted in behavioral economics and crisis psychology. Under normal conditions, human social cooperation is maintained by a complex web of institutional enforcement, laws, police, courts, economic incentives, social reputation systems. These enforcement mechanisms do not disappear instantly in a collapse, but they degrade rapidly and unevenly. Research on disaster sociology, particularly the foundational work of Yael Quarantelli at the Disaster Research Center at the University of Delaware, shows that the popular image of disaster behavior, panic, looting, violence, is largely mythological in the first phase of a disaster. People in the immediate aftermath of a catastrophic event tend toward altruism and cooperation. But Quarantelli's research also clearly identifies a phase transition that occurs as resource scarcity deepens and the perception grows that institutional recovery is not coming. This phase transition, which the research places at roughly 72 to 96 hours for urban populations under severe supply disruption, marks the point where cooperative behavior begins to degrade and competitive, self-protective behavior becomes dominant. The hidden science here is neurochemical. Prolonged stress elevates cortisol and suppresses prefrontal cortical function, the brain region responsible for impulse control, long-term reasoning, and empathy. A population that has been under severe resource stress for 72 or more hours is, on average, operating with measurably reduced capacity for the cooperative reasoning that normally governs social interaction. This is not a moral judgment. It is applied neuroscience. The people who will become threats in an extended collapse scenario are not criminals by nature. They are normal human beings whose neurological stress response is suppressing the cognitive functions that make cooperation feel rational and safe. The survival implication of this reality is that the prepper's most critical resource, more critical than water storage, more critical than fire starting capability, more critical than any piece of gear, is a realistic, evidence-based understanding of when and how the social environment around them will change, and a strategy that accounts for that change before it happens rather than after. The prepper who waits until they can see the threat has already surrendered the most valuable asset in survival: time. The correct strategic response, derived from disaster sociology and military force protection doctrine, is not paranoia or isolation. It is what military planners call threat horizon awareness, the practice of continuously modeling the social environment around you based on observable stress indicators rather than waiting for overt threats to materialize. This means understanding which resource pressures in your specific geographic area will reach critical levels first, which population centers will generate outward movement and when, and how the social dynamics of your immediate community will shift under extended resource stress. It means building your security posture in advance of visible threat, not in response to it. The evidence for this comes from detailed analysis of the Venezuelan economic collapse, the Syrian displacement crisis, and the Bosnian War, three distinct, modern collapse events that have been studied in detail by humanitarian organizations and military analysts alike. In each case, the populations that navigated the collapse most successfully were not those with the most supplies. They were those with the most accurate model of the social environment they were operating in and the most realistic, pre-collapse plan for managing their position within it. What connects these three realities, the neuroscience of hydration, the physiology of thermal regulation, and the sociology of collapse-driven behavioral change, is a single, unifying principle that the survival community discusses far less than it should. The principle is this: in a genuine collapse scenario, your most dangerous enemy is not dehydration, not hypothermia, not even other people in the abstract. Your most dangerous enemy is the gap between what you believe you know and what is actually true. Every dangerous moment examined here: the prepper drinking too little water because they feel fine, the survivor building a fire too late because they did not feel cold, the community member caught unprepared by social deterioration because they were watching for the wrong signals, shares the same root cause. Not ignorance, not lack of preparation. A specific, targeted, evidence-based misunderstanding of mechanisms that were understood in incomplete or oversimplified form. The last warning is not about what you have not learned. It is about what you think you have already learned but have not examined with enough rigor to trust when it matters. The science is real. The threats are real. The gap between surface understanding and operational understanding is where survival is decided, and it is decided, in almost every documented case, long before the collapse event itself. Preparation is not the acquisition of supplies. It is the relentless, uncomfortable, scientific examination of every assumption you have already made.
If you like this video, please like, share and subscribe.